Is Thursday at 12:30 here in the Mountain Time Zone, and that means it is time for our weekly Facebook Live session. As always, I want to start out with a quick COVID-19 update, and then we'll get into our topic for this week, which is gun rights. So let's talk first about COVID-19. The most significant thing that I want to name this week is the loss of four Northern Arapaho people on Monday of this week. I am deeply saddened by the way that this crisis has hit Indigenous communities especially hard, and I am sending blessings and love to our Wind River friends this week. It's also important to go beyond thoughts and prayers and actually advocate for changing policy that will then change people's lives for the better. So, in that spirit, I am serious about making sure that we have policies that address the systemic racism in our healthcare systems. While Indigenous folks are only about 2.5% of our Wyoming population, our current death toll from COVID-19 is about two-thirds Indigenous people. I don't believe that that's a coincidence, and I'm really pretty angry that we've allowed our systems to develop in such a way that this is yet another example of Indigenous people having to take the brunt of our inadequate systems. When you are already vulnerable, any crisis is going to hit you and your family and your communities harder. I will talk about these issues in more detail on a later video, but it felt really important to name it this week. I also want to share a personal COVID-19 observation. So I was in quarantine for 22 days and then didn't actually leave home for about another week. But this past Wednesday, I made an errand run down to Fort Collins, and it was very interesting and a little disturbing to see the vast variation in the spaces that I went to in terms of how people were behaving. So I was masked and gloved, and in one of the places of business that I needed to go to, I was one of just a couple people who were. And a couple people just blithely ignored the social distancing system that this business had obviously very carefully designed and set up. In other places, nearly everybody was masked and gloved and maintaining good social distancing. So I'm going to encourage everybody to be like that second crowd of people. And once again, please keep up these three things. If you need to go out in public, please use a mask, gloves, and maintain social distancing. So Governor Gordon recently pointed out that during the Spanish flu epidemic, things started to get a little bit better and people relaxed their caution, and then a worse wave actually happened after that. So please, let's not have Wyoming be one of the places to repeat that particular history. Okay, so on to the topic of the day. So, one of the more amusing moments for me behind the scenes in this campaign was having somebody back channel message me to tell me that I was running on nothing but taking people's guns away. And by the way, you're a millionaire, and so that's weird. So, like, wrong on both counts. Somebody clearly didn't want to do his homework about my actual positions on anything, or for that matter, my life circumstances, but that's kind of another video. But here's the thing, this is somebody I met at a county Democratic Party event originally. There are a lot of people around Wyoming who assume a stance on guns simply by having a D next to your name on the ballot. But the reality is that I've actually found Wyoming Democrats to support a surprising diversity of perspectives on this issue. So here's mine. So this session could either have been labeled gun control or gun rights, and I am definitely more on the gun rights end of the spectrum than I am on the gun control end of the spectrum. There's some interesting context here. So one of them is that laws in almost every arena are layers and layers that have gotten built up over time. And gun policy is definitely a hodgepodge of values, and it includes some very outdated definitions that make it really hard to have coherent, reasonable conversations about guns. And I actually agree pretty strongly with gun rights advocates that this lack of clarity about the terms allows people who don't have a lot of knowledge about guns to weigh in on specifics about policy, usually in ways that don't make a lot of sense out here in the field. So getting our definitions clear would actually be a really good step toward being able to understand where each other are coming from and what the actual issues are. There are legitimate concerns about gun violence. People, and especially I want to say young people who have grown up in the era of school shootings, are rightfully concerned about their safety. So I really want us to look at the data around these shootings. Where we have a really strong data correlating something, I'm open to some tighter regulations. At this point, the strongest correlation between mass shootings and anything that I've been able to find and that I think is legislatable is domestic violence. Over half of the mass shootings, over half of the mass shooters, rather, had prior domestic violence charges against them. So I do favor tightening regulations up in this one piece. So, right now, convicted domestic abusers currently can't buy guns, but they can own and possess them. Anyone with convictions, serious, credible allegations, or a restraining order for domestic violence, I believe, should lose their rights to own guns and possess a gun, at least until those charges are cleared. And we do have a serious problem with violence in the United States. And I think that it basically amounts to us using violence as a problem solving tool. So, interpersonally, we call that domestic violence. In some cases, we've elevated some of these situations to domestic terrorism when it fits that profile. Lots of people reach for gun control as a response to this, but that's not actually my inclination. My inclination is to look at this as a broad cultural pattern and address it in that way, rather than taking away one set of tools that do sometimes get used. So for me, violence is the problem, but guns are not where we should be focusing on our solutions. So I've spoken about this in one of the other sessions. I do have deep concerns about police violence and particularly police shootings. In Wyoming, we rank sixth in the nation for per capita police shootings, and police officers have higher rates of domestic violence, especially among less experienced officers than the population in general. And as I've said before, if somebody is a domestic abuser, they should not be allowed to be in law enforcement and should not have access to guns through their job. So, tightening that loophole is potentially, I think, much more impactful than any kind of like wholesale gun regulation. One of the hot new ideas out there right now that people have been talking about is so called red flag laws. And a red flag law is a gun control law that permits police or family members to petition a state court in order to temporarily remove firearms from a person who might present a danger to themselves or others. And on the surface, that idea makes some sense and it's gaining a lot of resonance with people. The problem, though, is that abusers can use this just as readily as people who are being abused. I'm not excited about red flag laws, which are just as likely to be used badly as they are to be used well. If we are going to look at something like that, I think we need to be very, very careful in how we design these laws to ensure that they are not simply aiding abusers in disarming people who need to be able to defend themselves. So far, I haven't seen a version that looks like it sufficiently addresses these concerns, and so I currently am not in favor of passing red flag laws. I am open to looking at tightening background checks, and universal background checks are a pretty popular piece. And I imagine if I do get elected, that's one of those things that I'm going to be in there with the debates talking about. So, my input into that debate would be that I think there's some pretty serious problems embedded in our background check system right now that I want to see addressed. Because people of color are far more frequently charged and convicted of the same crimes under the same circumstances that white people are, and because poor people are far more frequently convicted because they can't afford good legal representation, there are some really clear biases built into our background check systems right now that I would like to see addressed if we're going to go ahead and update those systems. There's also this interesting quirk that there's a number of things that once you have any kind of a felony conviction on your record, you end up losing certain rights. And one of those is the right to own guns. And so this is my question on that issue. You know, why, if things that they did were nonviolent, is there any justification for people to lose their gun owning rights? Where's the data that connects those two things together in some kind of coherent way? And at what point should somebody with a felony charge who has served their time be able to get their rights back to own a gun? I think that these are pretty serious questions and ones that I would like to have us look at very closely in the context of our criminal justice system reform. So, our criminal justice system has a lot of wonky stuff in it right now, and tying gun ownership to the standards that are baked into that system strikes me as being inherently discriminatory. How we dehumanize and strip rights from people with felony charges after they have served their time is really just one of those problems. So there's another issue that is closely tied in with guns, and that is suicide. So, one of the more interesting programs that I have looked into around suicide prevention is creating a voluntary system where someone who is having suicidal ideation can essentially check their guns into a safekeeping program, or simply, remove one of the components of the gun that's necessary for its operation and turn that component in. And then having a person who is designated by the person who is having the suicidal thoughts, who is the one who gets to sign off and get the guns back once the suicidal episode is passed. There's some very interesting variations on the theme of this kind of program out there, and I think it's one that merits looking at pretty closely. The reality is that people do sometimes use their guns to kill themselves, and I really like this kind of peer support approach rather than a legislative approach to reducing the likelihood of this happening. There's any number of peer support things that we could be promoting to reduce suicides, and this is just one of them. So, that's my take on guns. In summary, I am not coming after your guns. Unless you're a domestic abuser, and then I might be coming after your guns. But if you're using your guns to hunt for recreational shooting and for purposes of self defense, you and me, we're good. Thanks for tuning in and listening today. Join me this Sunday for our virtual town hall at 1 o'clock on Zoom. And this week's topic for that town hall is going to be student loan forgiveness. So thanks for being here, and hopefully I'll see you on Sunday. Bye.